No, too dark.
Hello, everyone. We will begin shortly. We're just giving people time to come into this meeting. Make yourself comfortable. If you're not muted yet, if you could please mute yourself. Good morning, everyone. We will begin shortly. We're glad you're here. If you haven't done so already, please mute yourself. You can do that by clicking on the little microphone at the bottom of your screen. We will just give it a few minutes for people to come into this meeting, and then we will begin. All right, thank you for joining us today for our virtual talk. Before we get started, I wanted to go over a few things. As I said earlier, please keep yourself muted throughout the presentation. And if you have any questions, please type them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker will be happy to address all the questions at the end of the program. And if you're joining us over from Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. Our Facebook audience can also ask questions using the comment sections. And please note that this talk is being recorded and streamed live. It will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. And I'm really excited to introduce you to our speaker this morning. Her name is Karen Helmerson, and she's a docent in the Timken's Education Department. She will talk to us about the High Renaissance in Italy. So this should be a fascinating talk. Thank you very much, Karen, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Christina. It was so wonderful to see Christina. She is the director of education at the Timken. She trains the docents, works with the docents, and she's a fabulous mentor. So thank you, Christina.
Thank you.
We'll begin with the High Renaissance in Italy. And I like to kind of make a disclaimer in that many art historians feel that the term High Renaissance can be a little bit misleading or pejorative in that why should we signal this out as high and other aspects of Renaissance not being high? But it is really the pinnacle of the development in art in primarily Rome, although of course Florence and Milan are important cities at this time. But the time period is when artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, Raphael, Bramante are creating these magnificent works that so many people know today because they were so exquisite. And so we will use the term High Renaissance, and I will give you some dates. Even the dates are disputed. Some people basically say that the High Renaissance begins in 1495 when Leonardo da Vinci begins The Last Supper in Santa Maria della Grazia, a fresco mural that literally took 3 years. So that is considered 1495, the beginning of the High Renaissance, and perhaps the end would be about 1520 with the death of Raphael. Other people think that the High Renaissance ends in 1527 with the sack of Rome, when Charles V's soldiers come into Rome and sack the city. So that is a little bit of a background on the term High Renaissance. And as I mentioned last week, when we talked about last month, when we talked about the Renaissance in Florence, for example. So in the heart of the Renaissance, It basically takes place in Florence, but then it moves to Rome. Why is that? Well, one of the reasons is Julius II, the Pope between 1500 and 1513, decides to make Rome the pinnacle of creativity and artistic importance in all of Europe. So many of the artists, like Raphael, really most of his career is done in Rome. However, artists like Leonardo worked in Milan, he worked in Florence, he worked in Rome, he also worked in France. And that is true for many of these artists. However, again, sort of the center would be Rome. Again, a couple more points I'd like to make before we start looking at the paintings. Charles V is Holy Roman Emperor, and so he has vast controls of parts of Italy, Spain, France. Very important person, not only for the arts, but politics and religion. During his reign, the Counter-Reformation begins in 1517. So that is the tail end of what we're seeing in the Renaissance. We also have other important people, as I mentioned, Julius II, and after him, Pius X. So these popes, along with Charles V, would be considered great patrons. We also have the Medici family, the Sforza family, who are paying many of these artists to create these great works of art, not only for themselves, but also for multiple churches and religious orders. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit are the characteristics of the High Renaissance. Well, these High Renaissance artists, particularly Leonardo, for example, use the technique called sfumato. And when we look at Leonardo's Mona Lisa, we will see the use of edges kind of going into from light to dark. We also have chiaroscuro, that high intensity light and dark that is used by earlier Renaissance artists. We have a man named Vasari, Giorgio Vasari, who at the tail end of the High Renaissance and into almost the later part of the 1500s, he writes about these artists. So he is considered the first true art historian, and he writes these biographies of the greatest sculptors, painters. So that's really important. And lastly, we need to remind ourselves what Renaissance means. The Renaissance comes from the French. The word Renaissance is from the French, and it means a rebirth. And we talked about that when we thought about a little bit of the early Renaissance. It's a rebirth in interest in Roman and Greek antiquity, and also, of course, the idea of humanism that Petrarch begins. In the 13th century, we have to think about moving away from that sort of medieval control by the church of humanity. This is human stories. And then lastly, these High Renaissance artists. Well, let's look at the Marriage of the Virgin just for a moment. Look at the perspective. Look how he creates three-dimensionality and multiple points of perspective that recede into the distance. And so perspective, sfumato, chiaroscuro, emotion, psychology, all these things are developing during this short 25-year time period. And of course, as it ends in the 1520s, then we begin to see characteristics of what we call mannerism. And I will sort of point that out. So let's begin with Verrocchio. And Verrocchio is really important. And you might look at the date and say, well, 1470, I thought you just said 1495 begins with Raphael, but actually, I'm sorry, Leonardo, but actually I wanted to show you the evolution of how these artists developed into such great painters, sculptors, and architects. So, of course, the great Leonardo da Vinci trained in Verrocchio's studio, as did Botticelli and a number of really important artists. So it's good to note, you can look at this beautiful Madonna and Child, and then when we move a little bit farther and you look at the works of Leonardo da Vinci, you will see some qualities, expressive qualities that you might link. The other thing is, if you look at the medium, we talked last time about the use of oil painting and the use of canvas and wood. Now, by this time, in the late 15th century, early 16th century, artists in Italy primarily were using canvas, but still wood was really popular. Also, they begin to experiment with tempera. The difference between tempera and oil painting, why they used it. Tempera is much more quickly, it dries more quickly. Oil painting does not. It's a more laborious process to apply oil painting. Second of all, tempera can let light shine through. And as I mentioned, chiaroscuro, sfumato, these are ideas using light and shading. So let's quickly look at this exquisite Madonna and Child. And what's unusual is, of course, the way the child is established in this window ledge, like this ledge where he's standing, and he's being held so lovingly by his mother, this beautiful face. And eventually you can see why Botticelli and Raphael later, Raphael did not study with him, but Botticelli, beautiful Madonnas kind of emerged from this standard. Now, we have some iconographic emblems, and I had a lecture on iconography, and we talked about symbolism. And symbolism here, these cherries relate to the passion of the crucifixion of Christ, the red, and then we have the rose, which is of course Mary and Queen of Heaven and her purity. How did he establish this very sculptural form? And of course, sculpture is so important at this time. And we will look, and many of these artists actually trained as sculptors too. And look at how human the Christ child looks. The other thing is, look at the three-dimensionality. When we think about how these artists put three-dimensional form on a two-dimensional picture plane, you really see their skill. This baby is fully formed. And when we looked at early Renaissance, particularly in the North, we don't always, this is not a disparaging comment about the North, but many times their interest is more spiritual. So they were less inclined to replicate a more three-dimensional form. But of course, with Italian Renaissance and High Renaissance, they were very inspired by the sculpture they saw in their own environment that was from the Greeks and Romans, and they showed three-dimensionality. So that's where we see this. Also, of course, the ubiquitous gown colors, the blue, which relates to the church, and then of course the red, the crucifixion. And then again, look at how she has a halo-like hat and this exquisite gossamer. The gossamer on the clothing of the baby Jesus, and the gossamer surrounding her beautiful face. So lastly, again, this ability to show three-dimensionality and dimension in this landscape. Now, when we go in a few more images, we'll look at the Mona Lisa, everybody knows, and you will see how that same, remember he trained with Verrocchio, that same ledge and more of her torso. This is kind of unusual to have either a full Madonna or just a bust, but this is sort of a 3/4, and that is rather unique. All right, well, look at one more Verrocchio. And this one is interesting because Virgin and Child with two angels, and Saint John is, the baby Jesus is in the arms of his mother. And we know that probably another artist, Credi, who trained with Verrocchio, probably did some of this painting. There's only one or two paintings extant that we know that Verrocchio did independent of his studio. Now, even in the earlier part of the Renaissance, you know that many artists did not work independently, at least in the beginning part of their career. They trained in these massive studios. And so like Bellini's studio in Venice, we've talked about, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we talk about Titian, but they trained in these studios. And so they sometimes helped each other. So what we think is, we think that this beautiful angel here holding the Christ child was probably painted by Verrocchio, but here, this angel holding a white lily, which is an iconographic reference to the Madonna, was probably painted by Credi. And let's make a comparison. Look at the skill in which this hand is portrayed. This not so developed. I've mentioned this over and over. It's a ubiquitous comment I make, but I think it's worth reminding ourselves that hands are the most difficult part of the human body for artists to create, along with faces. So well-crafted hands, the skill of the artist. The other thing that we think about this credi connection is look at the curling of the toes. Very unusual. And that was seen in some works by Credi. Another thing we see is, of course, look at the date. This was done about 20 years before this highly developed part of the Renaissance. But again, so it's kind of the segue between the early part of the Renaissance and then, of course, going into the classical and high Renaissance. She has a bit of an elongated neck. She has some of the characteristics of a Northern Renaissance Madonna, but she has an elongated body, which really predates mannerism, this elongation of the form. The other thing that I think is exquisite she has this drape that sort of opens the space and leads to her facial characteristics. And then, of course, we have an exquisite landscape. Remember, artists like Peter Bruegel in the 16th century, Leonardo were very influenced by landscape and also the study of nature and science and light. This becomes part of their vocabulary. And so landscape, painting by two, of course, the blue and red, so characteristic of Madonnas. Now, sometimes, bear with me, we're going to go to one of the greatest artists of the last 2,000 years, of course, the great Leonardo da Vinci. And many people who are interested in art, I can ask every one of you, and you would be able to tell me at least a half a dozen things about Leonardo. So we know that he was a great artist, but we know he was an inventor, and he created everything from types of weaponry, bridges. He developed a flying machine. He studied anatomy. He drew multiple sketchbooks that we can study his development in the human body through autopsy studies. So he was one of the most remarkable geniuses who's ever lived. The other thing about Leonardo, he worked in many places. So he was born in Da Vinci. His father was a lawyer. His grandfather actually raised him, but he went back and forth. He worked in Milan for the Sforzas. He even asked to work in Milan. He wanted to work for them. He worked in Florence. He worked in Rome. He worked in the French court in France. So he moved around quite a bit. But let's concentrate on this exquisite Virgin of the Rocks. There was actually, this one is in the Louvre. The second version is in the National Gallery in London. And why is there two versions? It was said that he actually was commissioned to do one of these. And when he asked for payment, they didn't give him a satisfactory amount of money. So he withheld it, painted a second one. And probably some people say this is the most beautiful. I happen to think it is, but that's just subjective. All right, let's talk a little bit about this. Now, I mentioned the term sfumato, this use of light shading. What is sfumato? You can kind of see it a lot of times with Leonardo in particular, you see it around the edging of the eyes, that bringing in a very soft kind of smokiness, and sfumato comes from that. Then we have chiaroscuro, which is this more highlighted light source, very dramatic, very stark. And just to throw in another art historical term, and if some of you have listened to some of my lectures on the Spanish Renaissance and Baroque, you know that they use what's called tenebrism. And tenebrism is a much more high contrast between light and dark. So we see here more chiaroscuro. So what we have is a grotto, this magnificent grotto, because you know that Leonardo was very, very interested in the natural world. And that's another characteristic of the High Renaissance. We have the natural world and an artificial world. We have quiet, we have motion, we have dark, we have light, we have human psychology. So a lot of things are juxtaposed in the High Renaissance. So we have St. John the Evangelist, and we have the baby Jesus, and then an angel who holds the young boy. And the baby Jesus is in a prayer formation, and the Madonna looks lovingly at him. You have this subaqueous set here. What does that mean? It's below the surface, that light source. And then you have this magnificent natural grotto, in the sense of it looks like the rocks are weathered. You see kind of the dripping, like stalactites, I think they are. But then at the same time, there's almost this mystical quality. It's almost otherworldly. So again, that juxtaposition of detail, look at that. But at the same, and the weathered rocks and the water, surface water, but at the same time, this magical rock formation. And we know his great skill at painting three-dimensionality and the exquisite beauty of the Madonna. And an interesting aspect of it is we have the angel with the red cloak, of course, the Passion, and then, of course, the relationship to the Madonna and the church. So this is one of his few extant, fully completed paintings, because as you know, even though he lived into his 60s, Leonardo was not a very prolific artist. He wasn't prolific in his ideas. He was prolific in his sketchbooks. There's myriad of sketchbooks, but not so much in the paintings. So one of the greatest religious paintings in the world is The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. And as I mentioned earlier, we really begin to see this as the genesis of the High Renaissance, because there's so much skill and technique in this fresco panel that we see the convergence of all manner of ideas. So even though it took him 3 years, he didn't work just systematically on this fresco. He worked occasionally on it, did other projects, and that's why it took a long time. But I want to tell you one of the most fascinating things I learned about the fresco and this church, Santa Maria della Grazia in Milan, where he worked for quite a while. During World War II, this church was bombed. And almost miraculously, every bit of the church, almost every bit of the church was destroyed, except for this fresco. So some people admire that and think, wow, you know, is that divine intervention? But that's a story. All right, so let's talk about this magnificent work of art. What we see is very unusual in that Leonardo creates the table for the Last Supper when the 12 disciples, one of them will be revealed as the traitor. It is shown where all the individuals are lined up. So we have the apostles all lined up, and you don't see any backs. That's pretty remarkable, and conceptually and stylistically. The other thing is what you see is kind of interesting sets of three individuals, four sets of three individuals, and that he sort of divides them. We have the main point of perspective over this pedimental structure you can barely see. And on the right cheek of Jesus, you actually see the single point of perspective, the main point of perspective. And then, of course, we have this coffered ceiling and this open, beautiful open window. Now, unfortunately, when Leonardo was painting, and in particular in this image, a lot of the materials were very ephemeral, meaning they disintegrated, unlike oil painting. But I mentioned to you earlier, he preferred oil painting, of course, but in order to capture light sources like we see here, and a little bit more distinct facial characteristics, and then also he was painting on a wet wall, as frescoes were done, wet wall. So the ephemeral nature of this was a little unfortunate because a lot of repainting has been done. So I just want to talk to you about a couple aspects of, the apostles are here. And there's these references, symbolic references. So here we have a Judas. And we know that's Judas for a couple reasons. He is the only one with his elbow on the table, if you look. Second of all, in one hand, it's barely discernible here, he clutches a bag of gold. That is a metaphorical reference to his taking of money for betrayal. And lastly, he knocks over a little salt cellar. That also references the idea I think it was in the Middle East, they said when you spilled the salt, you spilled secrets. So that is another element of this one character. And then lastly, we have St. Peter's here. I'm not going to, for time constraint, I'm not going to be able to go through each and every one of the apostles, but I will show you here because he's surrounded by Judas. You have St. Peter, and he clutches a knife. So a magnificent, memorable, probably one of the greatest religious paintings ever done. Now, again, if I asked everyone, tell me 5 things about this magnificent portrait, you would all, and many of you have seen it. I think for those of you who have not, most of you I'm sure have, it's very small. And now, thankfully, at the Louvre, it is in its own gallery because it just people swarmed and you could barely see it. So now they established it in its own gallery. Okay, let's talk about the Mona Lisa. It's done at the height of the High Renaissance. And again, it is considered the most famous portrait ever done, like in the world. And they used to call it La Gioconda because they used to think it was a portrait of Gioconda commissioned Leonardo. We find that in dispute now, so we won't use that term La Gioconda. Some people think it refers to her smile, which is in Italian a very similar word to Gioconda. But she is of the upper classes, but what's remarkable is, look, there's very little embellishment. So we do not see attributes. Attributes, of course, would be symbols of her heritage, her prestige. She really doesn't have that. But of course, she probably wouldn't have been painted unless she is a member of the upper classes. You wouldn't have someone like Leonardo paint your portrait of this portrait. The other thing, of course, I said there's no jewelry really. Now, I talked about the term sfumato, and it's so characteristic of this particular painting. Around the eyes, that kind of smokiness, sfumato, how the edges of the eyes are very, light and darkness here as it goes into light. I beg your pardon. This is a little bit of a glitch I have with my new computer, so please bear with me. Now, as I mentioned in the first Verrocchio, as the Christ child is on a ledge, remember Leonardo studied with him, this use of kind of this ledge format might have been taken from artists in that studio. You see her arms rest on a chair. There is a ledge behind her, and it seems that she's in a portico where you don't see columns, but you do see this idea of interior and exterior. Then, of course, this marvelous, marvelous incorporation of landscape. So fundamental to the painting. Many people also look at this little scrim of like a headdress, and also these fine fabrics embellished here, but again, not a lot of jewelry or any of, for that matter. And some people think, again, that enigmatic smile. I've always told you that, at this time period, people did not have good teeth. Many times the smile was just a little scrim. The other thing is she looks at us with confidence. You don't normally see this kind of confidence among the upper classes unless it's a male portrait. So that's pretty remarkable, and that she's also, so much of her form is present. So as I mentioned earlier, we either would have a fully formed portrait, but not too often, or you would have a more truncated portrait. This is a little bit unusual. So in terms of beauty, mystery, technique, so much about this painting makes it compelling to us. Now, we're going to go on, and we're going to talk a little bit about architecture. In my Timken lectures, I rarely talk about architecture or sculpture because it is not the main part of our collection. We have one important sculpture, but we're more of a museum dedicated to painting. But I do want to make sure that you understand that Bramante was the great architect, one of the great architects of the High Renaissance. So again, Leonardo, Raphael, Michelangelo, and Bramante. And this Tempietto is such a charming form. As I talked about earlier, the High Renaissance and also earlier in the Renaissance, many artists were dedicated to the idea of incorporating not only humanistic ideas and mathematical perspective, but they wanted to honor Greco-Roman heritage. So this Tempietto, small temple, is the joining of Christian importance, but it's also an influence, but it also marries what? Greco-Roman architecture and sculptural forms. Now, this is in a little actual courtyard of a larger church. And it is also St. Pietro, but it isn't the more important St. Pietro. This was a smaller church in Rome. And it was said to be where, it was said to be where St. Peter was crucified. So it was built as a kind of a reminder of that. And then we have a temple form that is actually what Bramante begins with St. Peter's Basilica. Because remember, St. Peter's, as we talk about it, you'll learn that multiple architects over a course of 100 years worked on it, and Bramante was one of the first. Now, so look at this cupola, this dome, that reminds us of the Temple of the Vessel. And we also have some Greco-Roman architectural elements that I want to remind you of. Okay, so here we have Doric capitals on these columns. And remember, Doric was the genesis of the development of capitals in ancient Greece. We have the Iconic, which is scrolled and more feminine. And then we have the Corinthian that opens up. And we see those more in the Hellenistic period. But this particular capital, the crowning of a column, is really a unique Doric capital because it comes from the Tuscan region. So they give it sort of a different name. The other thing is we have what are called pilasters. Pilasters are engaged columns on a building. They are not used to hold up the building. It's more decorative. These Doric capitals and columns, of course, have a structural. And then we have this sort of rounded balustrade and, of course, this exquisite embellishment. So this was really not more of just a signifier of St. Peter, and very small. It's a little jewel. And of course, today, the church that houses or surrounds it is filled with Italian Renaissance and High Renaissance paintings and frescoes. Excuse me, I want to make sure that I did not. Okay. Now, this is the Bramante staircase and in the Vatican Museum. However, there was an error, and no fault, just an error. This is not the original Bramante staircase. This is done, this particular staircase, double helix staircase, was done in 1931 by an Italian architect. Why? He copied many of the elements that Bramante used, and unfortunately we don't have it. We have the more modern version, but there are some similarities. It is a double helix staircase. And unfortunately, I'll have to wait till the end of the lecture to ask and answer questions, but you all, I'm sure, will identify a famous a famous architect's work in this staircase. And of course, that's at the Guggenheim with Frank Lloyd Wright. So this was meant so for the popes to be able to go unencumbered, unseen if they didn't want to. And also Julius II, I believe, was the one who wore such magnificent gowns that he couldn't walk up the staircase very easily. So the original has Doric capitals, very reminiscent of this form right here, that lined the staircase. And that allowed even horses to be able to be taken in an interior manner. So this is for the popes to go unencumbered. And however, this is one of two in the Vatican. This happens to be, even though it says 1505, I apologize, it's actually the 1931, that actually mirrored many aspects of the staircase by Bramante. Now, we're going to go on to one of my all-time favorite artists ever of the Western art is Raphael. Raphael actually did architectural work too. He did work on St. Peter's Basilica. Many people don't know that, as did Bramante and Sangallo and on and on. But he was known as a painter of the Virgin Mary. He did exquisite paintings of the Virgin Mary. But sadly, he lived a very short life. He was prolific, massively prolific, but he died at 37. This is a little bit of a off-color remark. He was said to be quite the womanizer, and he was acclaimed womanizer, and they thought that he died early of syphilis. No, probably a form of coronavirus, so a respiratory virus. So he died at 37. So he paints this magnificent marriage of the Virgin, and what we have here is this temple, because we don't see any Christian attributes here, but it was considered to be symbolically the Dome of the Rock. And then we have these courtiers. So isn't it interesting how many artists throughout the millennium will often incorporate people dressed in the costumes of the day, even though we're talking about ancient times. So we have these Italian high-born courtiers watching, but we actually have Mary and Joseph's marriage. And then we have, this is not God, this is a priest. So they're touching, probably transferring rings. We have a lot of three-dimensionality and elegance. Raphael was known for the elegance of his paintings. And then, of course, look at this massively interesting perspective, how our eyes taken all the way from foreground, middle ground into the background. Exquisitely done. And of course, the small figures here and this incredible landscape and this magnificent blue sky. So it incorporates not only the beauty of Raphael's form, the Madonna, other figures, perspective, and of course, this symbolic relationship to the Dome of the Rock. Now, because of, I'm sorry, my time constraints, I'm going to move on. And oops, I don't know what happened. Let's try another. The Madonna with the Goldfinch, one of my all-time favorites. And another exquisite painting by Raphael. And this one has a really sad but beautiful reference. So we have St. John, and he's holding a little goldfinch. Well, why? Why does he hold a little bird? Why does he hold it? Because it is tragically a reference to Christ's crucifixion. Why is that? If you look at the little goldfinch, it has a little red crest. And it was said that when Christ was on the cross and the blood from his hands, where he was impaled, was dripping, and a little bird flew by and a drop of blood fell on to the bird. And so it represents the Passion, the crucifixion. So little St. John, his cousin, shows the baby Jesus. And then we have, look at the face of this Madonna. Why is Raphael so remarkable in the painting of these women? It's just this exquisite beauty. This is like the high Renaissance. We have magnificent landscape, so detailed, so profoundly real, but again, this kind of melding of mystical and real. The other thing that the other thing that Raffaello does is he creates these triangular forms. That's pretty ubiquitous in his formations, that you have a pyramidal form. And of course, she's wearing, as we mentioned, the red and blue, and of the church, the blue and the red of the Passion crucifixion. Now, she holds a book, and the book is like a throne of wisdom, something about the throne of wisdom that she holds open, but it also relates to this throne of rocks on which she sits. And I've spoken to you about this, and you've heard this before, that the Virgin Mary is often shown in different formations. Sometimes she's high on a throne in Sacra Conversazione. Sometimes she's the Madonna of humility, seated more on the ground. But here we have sort of the throne of wisdom, which is of rock, to give her support. So this is one of the most exquisite Madonnas. And of course, it is at the Uffizi, one of the great repositories. And I'm just going to put in a little plug for my next Arts Reach lecture in March. I am going to be talking about great artwork in some of the most important museums. And one of them, of course, will be the Uffizi. So if that's a museum that you have visited or want to learn more about, hopefully you will get that. Okay, Galatea. This is from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and it tells the story of the sea nymph. And this sea nymph was actually, her paramour was Polyphemus, the one-eyed Cyclops. And however, she began a relationship with a peasant man named Acreus, and Polyphemus was horrified. His love was being wooed by someone else, and he takes a big pillar and he smashes on Acreus's head and kills him. But what Raphael is showing here is Galatea is her apotheosis, her rising from the sea and overcoming this tragedy. And so we have, if anybody's connected with UCSD, the Tritons, and they were half man, half fish. And then, of course, we have these Tritons. One tries to take one of these Nereids, these sea nymphs. He tries to whisk her away. And then we have another one blowing a conch shell to announce what's happening. And the little putti mythological figures are shooting arrows. And she rises on the sea from a shell, along with the dolphins who take the shell chariot over the waves. And we also have a sort of a minotaur form here. And then we have, sorry, it is not a minotaur, a centaur, I beg your pardon. Satyr, minotaur. And this one is so beautifully done. So we have the laurel leaves, we have the dolphins, and there's motion in this painting. It seems that she's actually in movement. And again, it relates to the fact that during the High Renaissance, we move away from portraiture of the aristocracy and both basically conventional religious painting to referencing mythological writings. Okay. And so satyr, minotaur, centaur, and triton. Now, we're going to go on, if I can fast forward. We're going to go to Michelangelo's work. And again, if you have visited the Academy of Florence, this is probably one of the most important sculptures in the world. And it is massive. As we all know, it weighs around 12,000 pounds of white, the purest white Carrara marble. And so 12,000 pounds, and it's just a half an inch side of 17 feet. Why was it so big? Well, part of it was first supposed to be in Florence Cathedral, high up in a niche. That didn't work out too well. So they put it outside in a piazza. For 400 years, this sculpture was in a piazza, but it began to get damaged to the point where on the right, we have this tree stump, which the Greeks used to use to hold up subtly a sculptural form to give it strength. And also we have this, he holds the slingshot here. So that originally was gold leaf, this portion and this portion. But because it was in the elements, it was disintegrated. And so when they brought it in, they decided not to redo that. The other thing is, of course, he's completely nude. And at one time there was a fig leaf, and we had more modest individuals who kind of promoted that. Now, who is this? This is David from David and Goliath. And you think of David, when you look at David's Donatello, Donatello's David, it's a very effeminate form and very thin. This is a muscular, beautifully formed man, exquisite profile. Something that's pretty remarkable about Michelangelo, who was, again, a painter, a sculptor, an architect, a genius, one of the most brilliant men that ever lived, and Vasari during his lifetime, because Michelangelo lived into high 80s. He lived till 88. So Vasari said of Michelangelo at his time, he was the genius of all geniuses. The other thing is there's a huge rivalry between Michelangelo and Raphael. They often competed for a lot of commissions. So I thought it was a little interesting point. Something that's really unique about this sculpture, when we look at it, you think it's profoundly beautiful and proportional. But if you look closely, look at the hands. And I believe, it's a metaphorical reference to the hand of the sculptor, like Pygmalion, it breathes life into the form. But these are outsize if you look at them. And so he holds here a little bit of a rock. You can not really see it, just right here. And then of course, a slingshot over. But this is David before he goes to battle with Goliath from the Bible. Okay, so we're going to go on. Of course, I always take a little too much time, and then I realize. Now, the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, many of you have seen it, and I saw it so long ago that it was prior, very young when I saw this, it was prior to the restoration. And among art historical circles, this was very controversial, because here we're going to get you two different viewpoints. This is more of the original coloring in the Last Judgment here. This is more of the embellished, redone form. And some people say the colors are a little bit garish. It's up to interpretation. Others say if we didn't restore it, there would be no Sistine Chapel. Now, when Michelangelo was given this commission by the Pope, his friends, colleagues, frenemies, Bramante, Raphael, they all said, he's a sculptor, he's an architect, he's not going to do a credible job with this. But over the course of 4 years, standing on a scaffold. Now, people assume he was lying and painting. No, he actually stood to paint. This, from the Old Testament, from the creation all the way to Noah's Ark, done over 4 years, is remarkable in its three-dimensionality. There's so much, I think there's over 300 figures here, everything from sibyls that come from mythology to some of the popes, to some of the characters from the Old Testament. And so which you can also see, it's supposed to be read from right down and come back around, I believe, if I've had that. I know it starts at the right. If you look at the beginning of it, the forms get larger. And I think he felt that that was, due to the importance of the figures. Of course, here we have the Last Judgment. And the other thing we have is this use of fool the eye, trompe l'oeil, because you have this grisaille outlining of the figures, which is actually painted. So these artists have this ability to create three-dimensionality, to paint human forms in such a realistic manner. Now, this was supposed to be Pope Sixtus commissioned this, and I'll spell the word Sixtus, and that's where the word Sistine comes from, Sextus. The other thing is this was meant to be a gathering place for the popes, a private chamber in the Vatican for the popes. Now, because I'm running out of time, I'm going to move forward. I just want to show you perhaps the most beautiful part of the Sistine Chapel, and that is the creation of Adam. And here we have almost a form of electricity that is said on the right to pass to Adam, and there's almost this electrical charge. And Adam is reclining, and we also have a reclining form of God, which is remarkable because that's not often shown. He's not often shown in lying supine, as it were. There's also a lot of talk about certain elements of this painting. And what we have here is God has his arm around a woman. And now we do have a religious scholar who often, Didi, who, if she's here, she can maybe give us a little more insight, as she always does. But some people say that this is Eve encircled by God. The other thing is quite a little unusual, well, not unusual, but that this is an umbilical cord. And this is actually could be anything from the uterus or the human brain, because there's aspects of the cerebellum, I believe it's here. So it seems that Michelangelo, and remember, just like Leonardo, he was investigating bodies to understand musculature, arteries, all that. So he was very adept, and of course we saw that with the David. He was very adept at creating the human form. So they say that his studies of the human anatomy might have inspired that. So of course I'm kind of running a little low on time, but I just want to quickly talk about St. Peter's Basilica. So it took approximately 100 years for this church, one of the largest churches in the world, to be consecrated. It wasn't until the 17th century. It was started by Bramante. And then subsequently, when Bramante died, Sangallo, Raphael worked on it. But it was Michelangelo's contributions that really attribute it to him. Here we have, again, that dome. And if we had looked at Tempietto, you can see the influence, because part of the design was Bramante. Now, I talked about capitals, and I said there's Doric, the flat, Ionic, scrolled, as many of you know, but these are what are called Corinthian capitals. These come from Hellenistic. Some of them are engaged, like pilasters here. We have these beautiful niches here, sculptural niches and sculptural forms here, and it is massive, a massive, massive basilica. And it was built where they say that St. Peter was crucified, so that's why it's in Rome. It was a church that comes from ancient times. It was Constantine began the first building of the church in the 4th century, and subsequently some of it was destroyed. And then by the time of the High Renaissance, it became important to just rebuild the whole thing. So I'm going to have to move on, but it's one of the 4 largest basilicas in the world, if not the largest, and it is in the Vatican area. Now, Andrea della Sarto, the Madonna of the Harpies. This is maybe the last painting I'll talk to, because I do really treasure your questions and comments, but this is the Madonna of the Harpies. And Titian, I was going to talk about Titian a little bit, because the beginning of his career really was during the High Renaissance. And I wanted to impress upon you that it wasn't just Rome, but because of Charles V coming into Rome, because of Julius and Pius, they wanted Rome to be the seat. So that's why most of what we're looking at takes place in Rome. This, of course, is in the Uffizi, but the Madonna of the Harpies, it's Saint Francis, Saint Francis here, Saint John the Evangelist. The Madonna starts with a pedestal. She's in what's called Sacra Conversazione, which means sacred conversation, obviously. We have the little putti. She holds a very sculptural, very manneristic infant Jesus. Now, she's stepping on these harpies. The harpies are here, and they are meant to represent destruction of elemental forms, environmental forms. So she's stepping on it, like stepping on evil. And they're carved here. And then we see the baby Jesus is kind of cowering. But if you look at the form and the elongated torso, you can see how De Sarto and others begin to predate mannerism. And if we look at the work of Pontormo and Parmigianino in the manneristic trend a few years later, you can definitely see the beginning of these forms. Now, I just want to see if there's, I believe we're really kind of running out of time, but when I do see Christina come into the picture, here she is, our own Christina.
Karen, do you want to end here?
I think so. If we have questions, we'll just, I can talk about this in a minute, but I really want to know if we have questions. That's important.
We do. And I wanted to thank everyone for coming in today. We had 70 people watch on Facebook, and everyone mentioned where they were from. So it was wonderful to see that people from far away, Vietnam, Melbourne, Denmark, Malta. So I was really impressed. Thank you everyone for joining in today. We do have a few questions, and I wanted to read just a couple comments because before I go over to the questions, from Wayne Hill on Facebook, it is rumored that the model for the Mona Lisa was actually a man. Any comment?
What an interesting point. Some people think it was also Leonardo's face. That has been said. And actually, can I just fast forward? I want to show you one because I did not get to this painting. Hold on. Oh no, let's go back. Just really quickly, we missed one painting I did. Okay, I apologize. I can't find it, but it was done by Ghirlandaio, and we didn't even get to it. I'm sorry, but Ghirlandaio actually used in one of his paintings his own portrait, and it's known to be his portrait. So we think that maybe it was Leonardo, but that's interesting. Not known for sure.
All right. And another comment in regards to the Mona Lisa, as ITA Pedagogo says, I've seen the original of Mona Lisa in the Louvre. Why is this famous picture of Leonardo da Vinci so small? I wasn't very impressed by the original. And you mentioned earlier that it's a very small painting.
Yeah, I mean, it was a commissioned painting, and they were not always, if it was done for a church, which obviously this wasn't, you would have these massive, like one of the paintings I wanted to show you was 20 feet high, because those were put in churches. But this was for private consumption, for a private home. It was commissioned. And that's probably why. And it's so funny. I tell people in the Louvre, there's a room that's adjacent, and there's a painting, The Marriage of the Virgin by Canova, I believe. No, not Canova. I'm sorry. Doesn't matter. But it is so magnificent. The Marriage at Cana. Sorry, The Marriage at Cana. And it is so gigantic. And it's Veronese painted it. It's massively beautiful. And so people say, maybe you should take as much time looking at that as the Mona Lisa. But because he didn't do a lot of work, Leonardo has this mystical following that, his work was so brilliant and not very many pieces done. That's
absolutely. Manny has a question too in regards to the Virgin of the Rocks.
Yes.
Please explain the process of oil on panel being transferred to canvas?
You know, that is a great question. And I unfortunately really can't give it a good answer. I don't know enough about it. I can tell you that Leonardo, for example, this is not answering the question, but, and maybe Christina, because she's an art historian too, you can tell us, but what Leonardo was experimenting a lot with, like gesso and liniment and all these different materials, because he could never really get the quality aside from oil painting. But Christina, do you know, can you answer that question for us? Because I'm not really sure.
No, it's a very difficult question to answer. And I'm afraid we would have to ask a conservator how that's done, because as you can imagine, paint on a surface to get that off and transferred to another surface is, I am sure, extremely difficult. And since I'm not a conservator, I don't have the answer to this as well. I'm sure it's a very complicated process, but it's frequently done. You read in the literature a lot that paintings are transferred. So, and that is done to stabilize the painting and to make sure that the painting, is safe at the end of the day. I see that we have one more question from Giselle. She is asking in regards to Leonardo's Last Supper, can you please discuss the hand gestures? And I don't know if we have time for that, but if you recall that painting, a lot of the apostles are gesturing. I don't know if Karen has the answer to that, but maybe you have a thought.
Well, I have a thought about that, because when it is disclosed that his betrayer will be revealed, they're all paranoid about it. So they're kind of, like, could it be this person? As they cluster in those groups, 4 groups of 3, they start to, let's say, be curious and frightened and angry about what and who will be that person. So I think the gestures are maybe like when you say, could it be that person? Is it that person? But the most important, from my research, the most important hand gesture, not that it isn't a good question, that's a very good question, but mostly the most important would be Judas, because of hand on the table, clutching the money, the salt spilled, those are the most important gestures. And Christina, you might even be able to answer the knife in St. Peter's, because that is not often an attribute of St. Peter, as far as I know, unless Dee Dee's here and can answer that, but clutching the knife too.
Right, it's more the attribute of St. Bartholomew, as we know from our portrait of St. Bartholomew, like the Timken.
Exactly.
That's
I was
right.
thinking
That's
the exact same thing. Yes.
Well, thank you so much, Karen, for a wonderful lecture. I'm afraid we're out of time. I wanted to let you know that we have another virtual talk coming up tomorrow at 11 a.m. Our docent tomorrow will talk about Tell Me a Story, Narratives in Art. And if you're interested in joining us for that tour, you can go to our website, click on the events button, and then you will see a list of upcoming talks, and you can register for the talk tomorrow right then and there. So I hope you enjoyed the talk today. We hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye now.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
My pleasure, really.
Thank you.
Let's see if I can even get out of my slide.